Hi, everyone. Hi, Nick. Thank you for the introduction, and thanks, everyone, for showing up here. So the idea for this seminar came up out of some funny situation that happened twice in my private coachings with two different students. And basically, I asked them, but why didn't you bet here? And they were like, because I rolled the RNG and the RNG told me to check. I was like, yeah, but I understand that this spot can be RNG, but I think here you can simplify it to a pure bet. I think in practice, this generates more EV like that. And so this made me think a lot. And I thought that a lot of players, especially new players that started to study poker already with solvers, so not the old school players that transitioned into solvers, basically have a bit of a wrong approach to game theory and to strategical implementation in the game. So I thought about designing a seminar which will target a more conceptual based approach, using some heuristics that can actually give you a better knowledge, a better understanding of game theory and of the strategy. And that's why I came up with this 4-session plan. So today in session 1, we will discuss how range distribution influences betting strategies. And we will discuss also not only see betting strategies, but also bets against missy bets and how to handle that. In general, whenever we make an aggressive action, we will discuss a lot bet sizings and what they're trying to accomplish. So this session will be a sort of conceptual scaffold, which will lead to the other session. So today we will discuss, we will lay off the ground. We will discuss mostly concepts. And in session 2 already, we will start to see how to implement this concept already into a sort of a practical and usable strategy. And of course, session 3 will be exactly this, like we will lay off 2 potential strategies that we can use in several situations against either a different type of player profiles, like we have a specific dynamic or a specific board, and we can play it with 2 different strategies. This is very useful because not only it improves your knowledge of the game, but also it allows you to choose whatever option you feel is the most profitable at the moment against a specific opponent or against the population if you don't have a specific read. And session 4 will be entirely based on your feedback, on your hand review, on any relevant case study, like whatever question you feel is appropriate towards the topics that we will discuss during this 3 sessions. Feel free to post in the chat or on Discord. Nick also will guide you for like in the process. So the first thing we need to understand when we study poker or game theory in general is to choose the right mental framework. In general, we need to think of solvers as extremely powerful tools, but not as the end point. So they're very useful tools that help us understand how ranges interact with different board textures. They help us understand whether we have the equity advantage, the nutted advantage, and how to implement this into a strategy. Like we will see different types of bet strategy, etc. So we will have a better understanding of concepts such as range distribution, hand classes, bet sizes, blockers and unblockers, and card removal. Today we will mostly focus on the first 3 concepts, like range distribution, hand classes, and bet sizes. And something very important is that whenever we think about solvers, we think about GTO. Whenever we think about GTO, we think about balance. But this is probably a wrong way to think about game theory, because if you think about it, the equilibrium, which is a balanced strategy, is not a starting point nor a goal of the solver, because sometimes the solver would like to bet more often or raise more often, but the problem is that when it's playing against itself, it realizes that if it does that, it will be punished with a line or the other. Like maybe it will check a range which is too weak, or it will be too vulnerable to bluff raises or to team value raises on the river. So in the end, balance is a compromise. That's my way of seeing it. So it's like 2 agents saying, okay, I cannot take any extra EV out of your strategy, and you cannot take it out of mine. Let's shake hand on this and have this equilibrium. And in general, being obsessed with frequencies, RNG, and balance can become extremely costly for a player's win rate. So it's just better to have like to understand what those frequencies mean, basically. And in general, understanding what we want to accomplish against a specific player, or if we don't have a specific read, we can consider population reads, of course, especially if you play on anonymous player pools, you can have this type of approach, and model dynamic strategies based on concept. It's way better than blindly following a blueprint strategy, which maybe you don't even fully understand, because essentially all that strategy is the result of a multiple iteration. And I like this as an end quote for the first slide. For a solver, the equilibrium is the destination, while for us is just the starting point, because for us, the equilibrium is something that shows us what is sort of a correct strategy. So anytime we see a deviation, or anytime we constantly want to deviate because we think one line will be more profitable, this is just the starting point. And basically, game theory is more complex than just a simple equilibrium or a blueprint strategy. Before progressing with the first analysis of the boards, we will discuss what are some of the most common misconceptions when studying game theory. So bet sizings, of course, are very important. Today we will discuss it in great detail. But keep in mind that nitpicking the perfect bet size is not really necessary. It doesn't add much in terms of EV. By nitpicking, I mean, for example, one spot you can use like a small over bet or a pot size bet, or for example, you can have a 30% or 25% bet. Like it doesn't matter that much. Sure, there will be some situation in which one size is preferred over the other, but in general, it's way more important to understand what bet sizing classes are preferred and which end classes want to use specific bet sizes. So what are we trying to accomplish by betting big? What are we trying to accomplish by betting small? This is a way more productive way to see the thing. And also, I already mentioned it, never RNG before thinking what your options are. RNG works mostly in two ways. When we are up against very solid opponents in high frequency spots, like for example, pre-flop, you have some like weak 3-bet that you want to do, but you don't want to do it all the time, because otherwise you will be 3-betting way too much, and a strong opponent will notice that. Or for example, you don't want to check raise too much, or if you have a checking range, you want to check some draws, some either flush draw or straight draws. So you need to be aware of the spots with strong opponents, because otherwise they will be able to exploit you on specific runouts. This is the first way, so high frequency spots against solid opponents. And the second one is when we're absolutely clueless about how our opponent is going to play in a close spot. So for example, if we are up on the river and we have a bluff catching spot, we don't know if our opponent is balanced, or if he's over bluffing or under bluffing. So we feel we have a good bluff catcher and we RNG the call, for example. This is an okay way to doing, but be very mindful of this, because most of the time you can feel you are in a close spot, which is not really close, because you made some mistake or you were a bit too loose or passive on the previous streets. So I discussed this concept a lot in one of my first videos, the compounding effect. And you can watch this video for further reference and basically understand better this concept in detail. Also, don't feel obliged to balance your value bets with enough bluffs. Before bluffing, ask yourself, will the bluff be profitable? Then bluff, even over bluff. Will the bluff be unprofitable? Unless you have a future metagame implication with the given player. For example, like it's a regular that you always face, so you don't want to show that you always check him with 7-eye, for example. In this case, you can under bluff with the recurring player. But if you're playing up against some recreational player that you feel will never fold, or like you're in an anonymous player pool and you feel that the population is always calling there, but they have no way to understand what you will do in the future, then just don't bluff in that case. So as a starting point for today, I decided to discuss single race spot in blind versus blind. A pretty interesting texture, 9-7 deuce rainbow. And why did I choose blind versus blind single race spot? First of all, because I feel that those spots are very interesting from a theoretical perspective, and they're also useful to lay off the ground when you play up against recreational, because you think about it, most of the time when you open from under the gun, middle position, you get called by recreationals from the cutoff or middle position, and they have wide ranges. So learning to understand how to play against wide ranges is very profitable, because learning how to play against recreational, of course, is where most of our win rate as poker players come from. So this is also a good way to develop strong hand reading skills and exploitative skills against different player profiles. So before we go on with this, I will show you a brief breakdown on GTO Wizard of the board. So as we said, we will discuss mostly bet sizings and then classes. And you can see immediately that we have a fairly relevant checking portion of the range. So more than half of the time we check. So it's not a spot where we want to bet any two cards at all, because the opponents will not have a hard time to defend against that. I mean, most opponents, we will get to that later. So, but we still see that the small bet happens around 20% of the time. So we have a third pot in Wizard. Then we have this intermediate bet to 50%, which almost never happens, like 5% of the time. And then we have the second pole, which is also around around 21% of small overbet and 75%. So we can converge this into like pot or small overbet, or even 75. Like, it doesn't matter if you don't use this 125, you can also use 75. Essentially, you want to have a big bet and a small bet and the check, if we summarize this up. So in general, we can say basically that the solver likes a strategy which involves a big bet, a small bet, and a check. Small blind has a slight equity advantage. And for this, I will take the actual solver sim to show you. So you can see that there's a slight equity advantage, 53.5 for the out of position player. And in general, basically, it's not that huge to allow us to blindly bet. We also have a strong advantage in the overpair portion of the range, which is why this counts as sort of nutted end advantage. It's true that the actual nuts here are sets, but essentially, whenever you have this texture, which is sort of dynamic, you want to extract the most amount of value out of your opponent's pairs and draws. That's why you see a strong prevalence for big bets with this part of the range, let's say King 9+. The small bet on my Pio sim drops a little bit compared to GTO Wizard. We had the 20%, here we have 11%. This is already something you can see a small difference. This can change because GTO Wizard is also using a limping range. I'm playing race full strategy, plus I put like 25% and GTO Wizard is using 33%. So all these little details will give you different different options. But basically, whatever is important to understand is that both lines are, you can use both of these sizings. It's just important to understand why we want to use a given size. And maybe in this spot, the small bet is less intuitive, because essentially small bet happens mostly with the weaker pairs, like you can see with the Queen 9, Jack 9, like this part with sets. And you might think, why set? Because they're knotted. But the problem is that sets are knotted ends, but they block too much the calling range. So that's why they prefer to bet small or to check. And also you see it basically with some second pair type hands. So in general, this small bet happens to have like to push a little bit more equity. But you always see that strong hands are never pure betting. Like even kings, queens, and jacks, even tens and jacks, which are the most intuitive big bets, if we take it from a conceptual point of view, they're not pure betting. This is because we want our opponent to not stab almost any two cards. Here I give my opponent half pot. It's a reasonable strategy here. You can use a small bet, you can use choose sizing, very impractical. I think half pot or 33% are good here, depending on how the small blind plays. So as you can see, the range is still slightly learning towards being more polarized. Like, you're not always betting your top pairs, and this is very important. You're not always betting strong second pairs, and you're not always betting draws. So not even open-ender straight draw like 10-8, which might feel like a blind bet for most players, but it's checking over 1/3 of the time. And you have an overcard plus an open-ender on a rainbow board. So it might feel like a nutted draw, but this hand is still checking. This is done because essentially you want to be able to have the nuts, like whenever you have a checking range, you want to be able to represent the nuts on different runouts. That's also why you see checks with draws from out of position, like you see also Jack 10 and 10-8 mixing there for the same reason. So you want to have nuts in the c-betting line, in the check calling line, in the check raising line. This is the idea of the equilibrium. So again, first, we said we want to be covered on all possible runouts. Second, we are building mostly a range towards extracting value out of pairs and draws on a board which is very dynamic. By dynamic, I mean that the top pair is very likely to change by the river. So we want to put more money on the flop and on the turn before we get some bad runout, let's say. And yeah, also against the small bet, we see that basically the imposition can almost call, like they almost never fold basically here. So essentially the small bet makes sense if you're playing up against a fit or fold player that they will massively overfold. This can be a strategy, but you have to keep in mind why you're doing that if you're doing it. So you can strongly deviate from equilibrium, do a very small bet based strategy, not use the big bet at all. Because maybe you think that your opponent against big bets, they might fold already these overcards. So you might think that your opponent will overfold against big bets. So essentially your strong hands will lose money as a big bet in this case. I mean, they will still make money, but compare the basically the EV here will be slightly lower than the small bet on the check if they are overfolding when you have jacks, for example. This doesn't essentially, it means that basically you have to model the strategy according to what you expect your opponent to play. Of course, if you play against a tough opponent, this is a very good strategy, and that's probably what I would play, but there are other options. So let's see also against the check. So here we have an overbet and an intermediate bet. We can also use the small bet here. Again, I didn't run it not to complicate too much the topic, but keep in mind this because we will see, keep in mind this frequency if you can, like, I don't know, take a snapshot of this. And because we will come back later when we will discuss some exploitative adjustment. So please take a snapshot if you haven't already. All right, so again, let's wrap it up a little bit for what we discussed so far. So again, small blind has a slight equity advantage, but not that big to profitably bet any two cards against a competent big blind. So again, a competent big blind. So keep always this this word in mind. Some of small blinds holding want to bet to realize equity in an easier way, hence the small bet appears, but with moderate frequencies. The texture again is quite dynamic, therefore some hands such as like this hand class, strong top pair, king 9 plus, and over pairs are incentivized to build a pot from the flop to get as much value as possible. We will see some pot control lines happening on unfavorable turns, like in general, turns that complete straights are turns where you need to be more cautious because, of course, if your range is heavily skewed towards big pairs, then turns like the 8, for example, will improve 7-8, 9-8, and Jack 10, which will be 100% in the big blinds range, but you will not bet big very often, except for Jack 10, of course. But like 9-8, it's not a big bet on the flop. 7-8 is not a big bet. So you will see that basically range distribution is also a consequence of the sizings you choose. So that's a very important concept. We will discuss it on also on future sessions of the seminar. But essentially, like, there's some iterations in poker in which by betting big, you completely cut out some draws. So even if some draws complete, you are able to represent them, but your opponent can never have them, or can have them only at a very low frequency. And this allows you to value bet way thinner. And those concepts are hard to master, but if you really grasp them, you can generate a massive EV advantage over the population that you play against. And again, also bluffs are, in general, are sort of neutral to sizings. They tend to model, like, they tend to work on card removal, but in general, they tend to, in this case, they want to fold out non-premium backdoors and 2 over cards plus backdoor straight. So folding out something like Queen 10 or Queen Jack is valuable, and it's something that, like, for example, if you have kings, the board comes at the turn is an 8, and no, let's do, like, turn becomes a king, and river is a jack. You don't have to worry about Queen 10 getting there because you folded it out already. So essentially, you have the nuts. But if you bet small, you will be up against Queen 10 some of the time. So you have a very strong hand, but it's not the nuts. So that's one of these differences, for example. So I would like to ask you already a question according to what we discussed already. So does it make sense to play half pot or check on this board? The first option is no, because the solver doesn't really like this sizing. It's missing the point of what different parts of the range of our end classes want to achieve. Yes, because we can play an easier to execute strategy and make less mistakes during the hand. Yes, if we have no idea about how our opponent is going to react to big and small bets. Or no, because we cannot simplify it to a range bet. So we still have to play a somewhat complex strategy, which involves a checking range and having to balance betting and checking ranges. So please vote.
All right, we're going to give it another 5 seconds or so, and then I will show you the results.
Okay, so the right option won, but for the wrong reason, I would say. So basically, it was a very tricky question because a bit all of the answer had some sort of reasoning into it. Like the first one is true as well, like because and in general, there's not really a hand class that really wants to bet half of the pot. So, but again, this is why we're trying to stop mimicking the solver. So we need to understand whether there is a case where, for some exploitative reason, it might make sense to deviate from that. We can play an easier to execute strategy and make less mistakes. That's a simplification, but still, like, of course, if you're going to make less mistakes from your part, it makes sense to play a strategy which will make you do the less amount of mistake. But still, your end goal should be to play the highest TV strategy against that specific player or against the population. So it's okay as a starting point, but you want to develop into that. The third one, I feel, is the most appropriate one, because essentially we have some end classes that prefer to go for one size or the other. So if, as I said, if we know that the opponent is overfolding to big bets, jacks are losing EV as a big bet. So if we don't know how our opponent is going to react to a big bet, then it will be tough, basically, also how to model our range on later streets, because maybe we will be up against a wider range or against a stronger range. So that's something we need to consider. And the fourth one, basically, yeah, it's like a sort of it's on the same line as the second one, essentially, like but for the basically it's a similar thought process, but essentially it's about simplification as well. So it's also true, like we still have to play a complex strategy. So if the only purpose is to play a simplified strategy, then it's not viable. So yeah, here we have again the answer, and I will show you this this half pot equilibrium. So we can see basically that now also some ace-high hands figure into the half pot region. So that's the first major difference here. So whenever we don't know if our opponent, for example, is betting too much against checks or is calling too much against big better, etc. Like, let's say we check and face a bet. Whenever we have ace-high hands, we're already in some sort of marginal territory, because if we're up against a player that is betting all pairs, ace-highs lose a little bit of value. So this half pot bet allows us also to sort of pot control against some specific player profiles like this. So as far as the betting frequency we go, which can check a little bit less. And in general, whenever you choose a smaller bet size, mistakes are less costly. This goes both for you and for the player that is facing the bet. So anytime you bet big and you make a mistake, it's going to be expensive. And that's why you need to have a very high confidence interval to play big bet strategies. So if you're not confident, I think you should try to play a simpler strategy. And I think half pot or check is a reasonable strategy to play here. Like, it's as a bread and butter, it's a nice strategy on this board, even though this is the least preferred sizing by the solver. So we already saw that essentially there is a reason to deviate from whatever the main point of the equilibrium or the classes is. And it is basically that poker is a game of information, and sometimes we don't have all the information. So we can only try to make the best out of the puzzle with the pieces we have and try to make some educated guess. And again, the response against the check is very similar. You can see that basically it's still almost the same strategy. And once we check, we have the exact same strategy. So it didn't change much at all. So let's go back with another poll. And does it make sense instead to play a range check strategy on this board? Yes, because if we want to play a simplified strategy, this is the highest theoretical EV strategy possible. Yes, if we're up against a villain who bets too much against the check, because we can punish them with aggressive check raising. No, because we are risking too many check behinds, and the texture of the board can easily change, making us miss a lot of value. Or no, because we allow our opponent to realize way more equity than they should, and we can face uncomfortable decisions with some hands that would sometimes bet to realize equity. So again, please vote.
All right, another 5-10 seconds.
Okay, so the fourth one won. The fourth one is actually an interesting reply, but the thing is that basically when you ask yourself questions, you need to understand where the question is trying to go. Because if I ask, does it make sense? I'm not saying, for example, that I always want to do this, but like hypothetically, against a specific player profile, does it make sense? So I apologize if I sort of tricked you by omitting this this part of the question, but essentially the correct answer is B, because basically range check strategies are extremely effective against players that bet too much. I will show you a sim soon. It's true that it's the highest EV possible simplified strategy on this board, but again, we already said we don't care about simplifying for the cost of simplification. It's true that we risk too many checks behind, but what we lose with the value, we compensate with the equity realization with the Broadway and the ASI portion of the range. And the last one I already addressed, I think. So let's see what happens. Here I just did a simple operation, which is called node lock. Yeah, exactly. B is the only one where it states we have a read. So it's a strategy that works if you have information about a specific player. Like, I'm not saying you should play this strategy against everyone. Like, we're just trying to discuss all possible strategies today, and when it makes sense to go. Like, you take one board, as you see, we're already discussing the third strategy. So first one was big bets and small bet. Second one was half pot and check, and this one is full check. So we're discussing when it makes sense to go for one or the other. But all options are viable in equilibrium. Like, all strategies are reasonable. You just need to like, even if you play this strategy against an opponent which is not the ideal profile, you're not losing much compared to equilibrium. So all strategies are solid. What we're trying to do is to understand why one strategy can be better than the other against some specific player profile. So here I node locked that I didn't do anything really crazy. Like, villain is not over bluffing. Villain, this is something very common at micro stakes and low stakes. Like, you will see players betting any top pair hand and good second pair hands. So, and betting all the time this 10-8 and where it was Jack 10. Yeah. So in this case, essentially, villain is not doing anything that is counterintuitive a lot. And basically, we can see that whenever villain bets, we have this massively aggressive strategy. And do you remember when I said, if villain bets too much top pair, ace highs are not that good? You can see it. Ace king is already folding, is break even on the flop. And ace king is the nut of the ace highs. So that's also why it came, like I said, half pot makes sense because maybe we don't know what to do with ace high. But when I say with ace high, I'm not saying like with ace six. I'm saying even with the ace queen, ace jack, and ace king. So those hands become negative EV as call. Essentially, against this type of player profile, we want to check raise very aggressively as an exploit, and we want to fold a lot. And yeah, basically, you see that now king 9 plus almost is pure check raising. So considering that our opponent is in balance, the solver is like, I don't care about being face up. I'm just massively punishing you for going super thin there. So the exploit is basically raising a lot, raising even those like double overcard hands, not floating. This is very important. Like, floats are good against ranges which are a bit more polarized because sometimes they will give up. But this type of range is a range that pushes too much equity. This is an important concept. So whenever you're up against ranges that push too much equity, you want to be more linear in your range construction. And the other very interesting approach, I hope also that you took the snapshot when I asked you to. Look at the difference now. Like now, if they check, considering they never have a good top pair hands or better, we're just bombing with over bets anytime we have worse than ace high almost. And we're bombing them with value as well. So we went from a very high frequency check to almost pure bet and almost pure overbet. This is because if we check our range becomes way stronger. Our checking range is way stronger because before we didn't have most of the king 9 plus, but now we have 100% of those, and our opponent doesn't have them as well. So our opponent is capped mostly to a 7x on this blank. That ends why you see this sort of strategy. I discussed also this concept in detail in also one of my Run It Once video. It's called on understanding, applying and exploiting range checking strategy. So for further reference, please watch this video, and yeah, it's being linked by Nick right now in the chat. So for further reference, if you want to like expand your knowledge about the concept, please watch this video. And I showed also some other interesting texture where it makes sense as a default strategy to go for a range check. So to wrap it up, we can say that poker is a game of information. Information is power. The more information we have, the better the decision we can make. And essentially, basically today, we saw one single board. The different type of information allows us to play completely different strategies that can feel very counterintuitive for some player. Like, I think that most players will not consider checking full range on that texture. But if you think about it, like if you think that maybe I'm up against a specific player that will make this kind of mistake, then probably it makes sense to consider. In general, we can think in terms of end classes and parts of our range. Like we can think about our range as a sort of an engine with different parts, and we can tweak the frequencies from 0 to 100. Like for example, if our opponent is a player that is never folding to big bets, we don't want to check. For example, this player will only bet ace-9 plus against the check. So like, let's say the classic loose passive recreational player. But they will always call a pair to big bets. Then against this player, it doesn't make sense to check raise pocket jacks because maybe you will end up against 2 pair plus and you will lose your stack when he bets. And he will check like 95% of the time. So against this player, you want to bet big 100% with jacks. Against a player that bets too much top pairs, you want to check a lot. You can even consider some imbalance strategy, like to bet with the hands that don't want to face a bet. This is some more advanced concept that we will discuss later on, I hope, in the future slides. I mean, in the future sessions. But yeah, of course it's something that doesn't work against the good opponents. But again, we're discussing a player that always bet top pair, so we're not discussing a good opponent. So let's always put this beforehand. And in general, keep in mind that big bets punish calling station, but as I mentioned also earlier, they are a double-edged sword and they require more confidence in execution. So if you make a mistake with a big bet, either from the aggressor part or from the part of the caller, you're losing more money compared to smaller bets. So you can use the big bet, but use it like instead of going for overbet or pot, for example, you go for B75. This allows you for a bigger threshold for making a mistake. Like it will still be a mistake. It will still be a slightly expensive mistake, but not as expensive as you would do whether you would make it with a bigger bet. In general, small bets punish needs. So I didn't do a third poll saying, does it make sense to range bet this board? But yes, it does. If you're playing against some, like if, I don't know, sometimes it happens with some recreational that they're really super fit or fold. They just call almost just a pair or a draw on the board. They never float. Against this player that play passively, they don't raise, they don't float. It makes sense to play this kind of strategy. Of course, it will be very hard to see a regular at small stakes that plays like that nowadays. Few years ago, it was possible to find those players, but yeah, the fact that it doesn't work against regulars, it doesn't mean that it cannot work against recreational players. So it's also something you can consider. And again, strong check already we discussed. They punish players that bet too much by allowing us to aggressively check raise. And intermediate bet, despite being the least preferred option by the solver in Equilibrium, they give us a good starting point if we don't have enough information. So it's a good, like if I want to have a bread and butter strategy on this board, I can say we can want to play half pot or check is a very good way to start approaching the spot. If we don't have enough information, it's true that it's a strategy that is not very hard to play against. It's a strategy that doesn't punish any imbalance, but it's also a strategy that doesn't have major drawbacks. So if it allows us to play somewhat simple, effective strategy, and before we have further information, it's a good way to approach the game.